On March 11, 1945, amidst the tension at Kanoya Air Base in Kyushu, Japan, a Japanese intelligence officer found his hand trembling as he scrutinized reconnaissance imagery captured by Submarine 47. These photographs recorded an observation so baffling that it would haunt the Imperial Japanese Naval Command for the duration of the conflict. A concrete vessel with no visible armament, yet equipped with heavy refrigeration machinery and surrounded by numerous smaller boats engaging in cargo transfers, leading to its classification as an unknown logistics ship. Through the grainy lens of periscope photography snapped near Ulithi Atoll, he had uncovered evidence that stood in stark contradiction to every principle of warfare priority held by the Imperial Japanese Navy. While pilots at his own airfield were reduced to extracting pine root oil to supplement aviation fuel, a desperate initiative employing 34,000 distillation units to yield a mere 3,000 barrels, and mechanics drained industrial alcohol from machinery to power aircraft, the Americans had deployed a non-combat vessel dedicated entirely to refrigeration. 24 Yokosuka P-1Y-1 Francis bombers sat on the runway, prepared for Operation Tan No. 2, crewed by pilots who often possessed less than 50 hours of flight training and were destined to fly their explosives-laden aircraft into the American fleet at Ulithi. Yet, what none of them realized was that they were striking at an enemy capable of constructing a $1 million floating factory that produced 500 gallons of ice cream per shift, amounting to 5 tons of frozen dessert daily, while the Japanese forces were reduced to scraping pine bark for fuel. The first indications of this overwhelming disparity emerged through prisoner interrogations following the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. After the carrier Zuikaku sank on October 25th, American destroyers pulled Japanese sailors from the oil-slicked waters, and although the Japanese destroyers Wakatsuki and Kua had rescued 862 men, while 842 perished, those survivors picked up by the Americans expected execution, but instead received medical treatment and food. Most shockingly, they were served something many had never encountered: frozen cream presented in metal cups. A survivor's account, preserved in Allied interrogation files, vividly described an American sailor bringing him ice cream, a dessert he had heard of but never tasted, noting the surrealism of being served frozen treats by the very enemy he had tried to kill moments prior, just after the greatest naval battle in history. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, the creator of the kamikaze special attack units, actively suppressed such reports, knowing his pilots needed to believe the Americans were weak and unable to endure hardship. If they realized the truth of American industrial superiority, it would destroy what little remained of their fighting morale. The first documented Japanese observation of this logistics capability came through submarine reconnaissance in December 1944, when submarine I-47, under Commander Zenji Orita, surfaced near Ulithi for periscope observation before launching Kaiten manned torpedoes. Orita, who commanded I-47 from July 10, 1944 through the war's end, recorded in his log at 0630 hours the sighting of a large concrete vessel, approximately 80 meters in length, with no armament but heavy refrigeration equipment on deck, surrounded by multiple small craft conducting transfers. What he had spotted was the U.S. Navy's Barge Refrigerated Large, known as the BRL, which had been converted from an Army concrete barge at a cost of $1 million, a sum equivalent to $17.2 million in 2024. This vessel operated continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, producing 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes, and storing 2,000 gallons at 15 degrees Fahrenheit, ultimately churning out 500 gallons per shift, or approximately 5 tons daily. By January 1945, Japan's strategic situation had become desperate beyond Western comprehension, with fuel becoming so scarce that the battleship Yamato was forced to conduct training exercises at anchor to conserve oil. The Pine Root Oil Program, which mobilized 400,000 workers alongside millions of school children and employed 34,000 distillation units, ultimately produced only 3,000 barrels of aviation fuel from 70,000 barrels of pine oil, a total that was less than what the U.S. Navy consumed in a single day of operations. The 343rd Naval Air Group, or Kokutai, Japan's last elite fighter unit commanded by Captain Minoru Genda, the architect of Pearl Harbor, struggled with severe malnutrition while tasked with clearing airspace for kamikaze operations from January 15, 1945. Although specific calorie counts were not documented, the pilots reported suffering from night blindness due to vitamin deficiency, reduced reflexes, and a debilitating inability to withstand G-forces during combat maneuvers. Captain Genda himself wrote in operational reports that his pilots' eyes failed them at night because malnutrition had stolen their vision, causing them to shake from weakness during maneuvers, even as they faced an enemy who grew stronger each day. This contrast was starkest in the kamikaze units preparing for their final missions, where teenage pilots, with only 40 to 50 hours of flight training, received final meals of rice balls, dried fish, and ceremonial sake. Before their one-way sorties, they donned seninbari, 1,000-stitch belts, sewn by women for spiritual protection, though everyone understood that no cloth could offer defense against anti-aircraft fire. At Kanoya Air Base on March 11, 1945, kamikaze pilots composed their death poems before boarding their aircraft, with one such poem preserved in the Kanoya Air Base Museum, reading, "Like cherry blossoms in the spring, let us fall pure and radiant." These pilots died attempting to crash into ships at Ulithi, where the USS Randolph, CV-15, suffered damage at 2007 hours that evening after a Francis bomber successfully struck the carrier's stern, killing 25 sailors and wounding 105. The carrier was repaired in just 3 weeks, using 29 tons of structural steel, including I-beams salvaged from a Japanese sugar mill on Saipan, and during this restoration period, her crew consumed approximately 3,000 gallons of ice cream from base facilities. Ulithi Atoll, a tiny coral formation often omitted from maps, had evolved into the world's largest naval facility, representing a scale of logistics and abundance that remained entirely beyond Japanese comprehension. By March 1945, as the threat of kamikaze attacks loomed, the lagoon at Ulithi anchored a staggering fleet of 722 ships, a naval force larger than the Imperial Japanese Navy at the height of its power. This massive assembly served as the staging ground for the invasion of Okinawa, boasting facilities that completely defied the enemy's comprehension. The logistical infrastructure functioned like a floating metropolis, featuring complete machine shops housed in dry docks and a fleet post office processing 20 tons of mail every single day. The Americans maintained a surreal level of normalcy, offering movie theaters screening the latest Hollywood films, baseball diamonds on Mog Mog Island, and a bakery ship that churned out fresh bread around the clock. Perhaps the most potent symbol of this abundance was the USS Aberton, which distilled seawater and baked pies, alongside a dedicated concrete barge producing 5 tons of ice cream daily. This ice cream barge achieved legendary status among American sailors, serving as a beacon of morale in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Crews from destroyers lacking their own freezing equipment would dispatch small boats with empty containers, returning laden with gallons of vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry. In a display of democracy through dairy, the barge served every rank equally, from admirals to ordinary seamen, ensuring that this luxury was accessible to all. Japanese intelligence found these supply priorities impossible to grasp, a sentiment later echoed by Captain Tamichi Hara, the Empire's most successful destroyer commander, who survived the war's major engagements. Having commanded the destroyers Amatsukaze and Shigure through 14 major battles, Hara confessed in his memoir, Japanese Destroyer Captain, that they initially believed the intelligence reports were erroneous. Hara wrote that it was inconceivable for a navy to dedicate entire ships to manufacturing ice cream while his own forces were desperately scraping for fuel. The concept that any military would prioritize such luxuries during a total war seemed so absurd that intelligence officers concluded the intercepted manifests must be coded messages. Analysts reasoned that ice cream mix surely referred to ammunition, chocolate syrup indicated fuel oil, and strawberry topping was likely a cipher for medical supplies. However, the evidence became undeniable as prisoners reported ice cream on every vessel larger than a destroyer, and reconnaissance photos revealed refrigerated ships at every major American base. The sheer volume of these morale supplies, which exceeded the total food rations for entire Japanese fleets, was meticulously documented by Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto of the submarine I-58. In his memoir, Sunk, The Story of the Japanese Submarine Fleet, 1941 to 1945, the man who would later sink the USS Indianapolis described observing these floating cities of abundance through his periscope. Hashimoto noted the stark contrast, writing that while his crew counted their last torpedoes and rationed fuel by the liter, the Americans maintained peacetime routines in the heart of a war zone. His executive officer recorded seeing sailors lining up at refreshment stands to receive white containers of ice cream, realizing with dread that the enemy possessed the power to remain comfortable even during the apocalypse. Captured pilots provided even more baffling testimony during Operation Kikusui, the 10 waves of massed kamikaze attacks unleashed on Okinawa between April and June of 1945. One aviator, taken prisoner after an engine failure aborted his suicide mission, described an American destroyer that continued normal operations even while under assault. The prisoner observed that, aside from the gunners manning their stations, the crew showed no signs of panic, with sailors in white uniforms continuing to serve food as if nothing were amiss. This behavior shattered their expectations of a desperate enemy. What they were witnessing, without fully understanding it, was the supreme confidence of American anti-aircraft defenses. While kamikaze pilots began their terminal dives, American sailors were seemingly secure enough to maintain ice cream service on the deck. By 1945, the production of this dessert in the Pacific had reached an industrial scale that dwarfed entire Japanese nutritional programs. The specific output numbers were staggering. The Navy barge at Ulithi produced 500 gallons a shift, dispensing 10 gallons every 7 minutes, while the Army operated 3 barges with a combined capacity of 1,500 gallons. Furthermore, every carrier, battleship, and cruiser possessed its own machines, and base facilities often hosted multiple production plants. To illustrate the disparity, in 1943 alone, the military shipped 135 million pounds of dehydrated ice cream mix, and the Army Quartermaster Corps aimed for an annual production of 80 million gallons. In stark contrast, Japan was reduced to distilling 3,000 barrels of pine root oil from 34,000 units, with aviation fuel reserves plummeting below 1.5 million barrels. While American forces enjoyed these comforts, Japanese civilian caloric intake dropped from 2,000 pre-war to 1,680 by the summer of 1945, with pilot training limited to a mere 40 hours due to fuel shortages. Putting this in perspective, the daily rice ration for the entire Japanese military defense force on the home islands weighed less than the tonnage of ice cream consumed by Americans in the Pacific Theater. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who personally approved the ice cream barge, understood a psychological truth that the rigid Japanese hierarchy could not accept: that morale is not built solely on ideology and sacrifice. In a classified memo, Nimitz argued that demonstrating American industrial might through crew comfort instilled a unique confidence, as a sailor who knows his country can provide ice cream in combat fights differently than one expecting only hardship. This philosophy was epitomized during the sinking of the USS Lexington and the Battle of the Coral Sea on May 8, 1942, where sailors famously raided the freezers and scooped ice cream into their helmets before abandoning ship. This act demonstrated a set of priorities completely incomprehensible to a Japanese military culture built on suffering as a virtue, leaving their officers with the impossible choice of how to maintain fighting spirit against an enemy whose luxury would destroy their morale. How could one possibly rationalize the staggering disparity where Japanese sailors were lucky to receive a daily ration of 315 grams of rice, while their American counterparts were supplied with 5 tons of ice cream from a single dedicated barge? Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, the commander of battleship operations who would later lead the final kamikaze mission on August 15, 1945, recorded a chilling realization in his diary after reviewing intelligence on American amenities. He concluded that if these reports of comfort were accurate, Japan had completely misjudged the nature of the conflict. For sheer spiritual fortitude cannot defeat an adversary capable of bringing such luxury to the battlefield. Although this disheartening intelligence was classified above top secret, with officers sworn to absolute silence, the truth inevitably seeped through the walls of censorship, spreading across the fleet in hushed whispers. Japanese radar operators and observers began to notice B-29 bombers lingering at high altitudes, circling without any apparent tactical objective, a behavior that baffled military strategists at the time. Post-war records later clarified that these crews were actually manufacturing ice cream by mixing powdered milk, sugar, and cocoa in ammunition canisters. They utilized the minus 50-degree Fahrenheit temperatures at 30,000 feet to freeze the concoction, relying on the natural turbulence of flight to churn the mixture. This act of creating dessert over hostile territory or the enemy below desperately launched fighters fueled by pine root oil demonstrated a profound civilizational surplus applied to the theater of war. At the very moment Japanese mechanics were forced to drain hydraulic fluid for emergency fuel, American airmen were casually improvising ice cream machines at bombing altitudes. In stark contrast, Operation Kikusui launched 10 massive kamikaze waves against the American fleet at Okinawa between April 6th and June 22nd, 1945, resulting in the loss of 1,465 aircraft and 4,000 pilots. These Japanese aviators piloted obsolete machines running on alcohol-diluted fuel, which diminished engine performance by 30%. Furthermore, their final meals before these suicide missions often consisted of nothing more than rice balls and water, which was frequently the only substantial sustenance they had consumed in days. Following the devastating attack on April 6, 1945, which involved 355 kamikaze aircraft, sinking 6 ships and damaging 22 others, American fleet reports paradoxically noted that morale remained high, while ice cream consumption surged by 40%. The psychological value of serving this frozen treat immediately after combat was immense, as it symbolized a return to normality, comfort, and the safety of home amidst the chaos of war. The 11,250 Japanese naval personnel captured at Okinawa provided testimonies that completely dismantled their superiors' assumptions about the enemy. One destroyer officer, rescued from the water after his ship was destroyed, recounted through interpreters that while he awaited torture or execution, a young American sailor instead offered him vanilla ice cream in a metal cup, apologizing that they had run out of chocolate. This officer confessed that he wept not out of gratitude, but from the crushing realization that his nation had been defeated long before the fighting started, simply because their enemy could afford to feed prisoners such luxuries. These accounts, though suppressed during the conflict, were preserved in occupation records and exposed a logistical and cultural gulf between the two forces, far greater than the Japanese command had ever imagined. When the occupation began in August 1945, American forces distributed ice cream to Japanese children, many of whom were tasting it for the first time in their lives. This simple act profoundly undermined wartime propaganda, as the frozen dessert effectively disproved everything the military government had claimed about American barbarism and alleged weakness. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading surviving ace with 64 confirmed victories, first tasted ice cream at a U.S. airbase in 1946. In his memoir, Samurai, he wrote that this moment clarified why Japan lost. They had fought under the belief that suffering created strength, whereas the Americans fought with the unshakable confidence of material abundance. While the Japanese viewed comfort as a weakness, their adversaries understood it as a fundamental right that their industrial might could guarantee in any corner of the globe. The final statistics of these two nations reveal the complete story of two entirely different types of warfare. By 1945, a single American Navy ice cream barge could produce 500 gallons daily, while the Army operated 3 vessels that combined for 1,500 gallons each day, with total military ice cream production reaching 80 million gallons annually, and every ship larger than a destroyer equipped with its own machinery. The scale was immense, costing $1 million per barge, which equates to $17.2 million in 2024. In stark contrast, the Japanese reality of 1945 involved uncertain rice rations of just 315 grams per sailor and a desperate mobilization of 400,000 workers to produce merely 3,000 barrels of pine root oil. Pilot training was slashed to between 40 and 50 hours, down from over 500 pre-war, and they relied on fuel diluted with 30% alcohol, which severely hampered engine performance. For a Japanese military culture rooted in Bushido, where suffering was accepted as spiritual purification, the existence of American ice cream ships was utterly incomprehensible. The Americans viewed comfort not as a weakness, but as a force multiplier, and treated abundance not as decadence, but as a decisive strategic advantage. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the attack on Pearl Harbor and survived the war, later converted to Christianity and cited the treatment of prisoners as a catalyst for his transformation. He remarked that learning Americans fed their enemies not just food but luxury items like ice cream proved they were not the barbaric adversaries he had been warned about, but rather a civilization confident enough to afford kindness, even during war. These ice cream ships challenged every sacred assumption of Japanese military culture, a gap that remained evident even at a 1985 veteran reunion in Hawaii. When Japanese veterans asked former CB Robert Mitchell about the barges, he simply shrugged and noted that they figured the troops needed ice cream, a casual attitude that illustrated the colossal industrial and cultural gulf between the two navies, better than any battle statistics ever could. Tadamasa Itatsu, a former trainer of suicide pilots who attended the reunion, distilled the conflict's essence into a chilling observation. While his nation trained young boys to face death on empty stomachs, the enemy prepared their troops to survive on full meals and dessert. This sentiment is echoed by Dr. John Dower in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Embracing Defeat, where he notes that the ice cream barge at Ulithi symbolized a strategic dominance far greater than any battleship fleet. The vessel sent an unmistakable message that the United States had effectively already won, possessing the resources to provide luxuries while simply waiting for Japan to accept the reality of their situation. Military historian Richard Frank expanded on this, arguing that the opposing forces were not just utilizing different strategies, but represented entirely different civilizations, one fighting to die gloriously, and the other fighting to live comfortably. This stark disparity is memorialized today at the Kanoya Air Base Museum in Kagoshima Prefecture, where a small, often overlooked placard added in the 1990s explains the existence of American ice cream ships. This context is crucial for understanding the impossible odds these pilots faced, offering a glimpse into the industrial chasm between the two nations. The museum presents a devastating visual juxtaposition, displaying a kamikaze pilot's final meal, a modest rice bowl, pickled vegetables, and a cup of sake, alongside a photograph of the American ice cream barge at Ulithi, retrieved from Naval Archives. As museum curator Takeshi Yamada explains, this image alone narrates the entire history of the Pacific War, helping visitors, particularly the younger generation, comprehend how Japan lost so completely. It was not merely a military defeat, but a collision between a nation scraping pine trees for fuel and a superpower building ships specifically to manufacture frozen treats. The anecdote of Japanese commanders discovering these ice cream ships exposes the fundamental nature of power in modern warfare, contrasting Japan's reliance on spirit and the endurance of suffering against America's capacity to eliminate suffering entirely. While the Japanese military was forced to operate 34,000 distillation units just to extract 3,000 barrels of crude fuel from pine roots, the United States commissioned million-dollar barges dedicated to dessert. This reality meant that noble kamikaze pilots were flying into oblivion against a society that could maintain normalcy and abundance, even in the extremity of global conflict. The cultural and industrial gap was absolute. Japanese pilots spent their final hours writing death poems before 50-hour training flights, while American sailors debated the merits of vanilla versus chocolate. Japan measured its potential for victory in spiritual terms, whereas America measured success through sheer industrial output, including the production of ice cream at a rate of 10 gallons every 7 minutes. The war ultimately ended not because Japan ran out of pilots willing to sacrifice themselves, but because their leadership finally grasped that they were fighting a society so powerful it could dedicate entire vessels to luxury. In the final analysis, the statistics render the outcome undeniable. Against the Japanese Navy's peak strength of approximately 700 ships, the Americans positioned 722 vessels at Ulithi alone. The disparity extended to every facet of the war, with a single barge producing 500 gallons of ice cream per shift, while Japan's total aviation fuel from pine roots amounted to only 3,000 barrels. American bomber crews were even making ice cream in the freezing air at 30,000 feet, while Japanese trainees struggled with diluted fuel and rations of just 315 grams of rice. When Japanese commanders realized that the United States possessed ships solely for making ice cream, they discovered a truth more profound than any standard military intelligence could provide. They understood they were facing an enemy who had already secured victory, knew it with absolute certainty, and was confident enough to bring dessert to the apocalypse. The ice cream ships served as proof, later confirmed by the atomic bombs, that Japan was fighting the last war of scarcity against the first war of abundance. The outcome was incomprehensible to a leadership that believed suffering equaled strength, only to learn too late that true power is the ability to never suffer at all. The million-dollar barge at Ulithi, churning out 10 gallons every 7 minutes while Japanese pilots prepared for death, was not merely a ship. It was evidence of a civilization that had won the war before the first battle began. Japan had brought spiritual resolve to a contest of industrial comfort, and in doing so, had already lost.